Wait,
AJC.
hold on. Okay, go.
Hi, my name is Rob Latin. I'm a foreign affairs correspondent at JSpace. Joining me today is AJC's Steve Bayme. Steve is director of the institute that deals with Israeli and American Jewish relations. Steve, you have been very outspoken about Peter Beinart and his new book, The Crisis of Zionism. There's a lot of talk about whether Peter is in fact a Zionist, whether he cares about Israel. What are your thoughts on the matter?
Look, certainly last summer I did a seminar with AJC lay leadership, which was called precisely Intellectuals' Criticisms of Israel. And I began by distinguishing between Walt and Mearsheimer, whom I really see as being anti-Zionist. And essentially they feel that American Jewry has hijacked American foreign policy to assist the state of Israel. And I distinguished between that and Peter Beinart, who I said remains a Zionist. And he has criticisms of Israeli policy, but he should not be seen in the same context as Walt and Mearsheimer. So in that sense, this debate of is Peter a Zionist or not, I have a lot of respect for Peter. His time at the New Republic certainly demonstrated his Zionist convictions. I think he could have written an important book about liberal Zionism and the need to resuscitate it. But I certainly am not interested in any kind of discussion that says, has Peter Beinart abandoned his Zionist roots? I think he makes some very fundamental misstatements and overstatements in the book, but I certainly would not charge him with overstepping the boundaries of what is Zionism. I would like to see a Zionism that is large enough and inclusive enough to include him.
Is there any support for his claim that, whether you agree with the occupation or not is fairly irrelevant of the West Bank? There are certainly security issues on the ground that, have to be dealt with, but can we agree or should we agree or disagree with the longer we stay there, the more likely it is that democracy inside of Israel will erode?
Look, there are long-term threats to Israeli democracy. They're by no means limited to the settlements. They have to do with entire issues of religion and state. Israel is a new democracy in the world. It's relatively young, only 64 years. There's no democracy that is perfect. I was reading, I think, 2 summers ago, I was at Brandeis University, where an Israeli political scientist put together sort of a table of how do democratic countries rank in the world. Israel ranked about 7th. It's not bad at all.
No.
So in that sense, starting point is that Israel was born as a democracy, remains a democracy. No democracy is perfect. Israel does face some long-term threats that are by no means limited to the occupation. On the other hand, Israel is also facing existential threats in terms of those who would like to wipe her off the map. So to draw this rather simplistic point of saying either Israel remains a democracy or it becomes a permanent occupying power, the world isn't that binary, if you don't mind
Sure.
my pun. The world isn't that simple. There's an awful lot going on in between. In terms of the West Bank itself, look, maps have been developed indicating that you could retain 70% of the settlers with fairly minor border adjustments. A two-state solution is absolutely necessary for Israel's future as a Jewish state. Not necessarily for reasons of democracy, but for reasons of demographics. So in that sense, a two-state solution is absolutely necessary. I don't think we've reached the point or come near reaching the point where that two-state solution is impossible.
How do individuals like AJC's David Harris and the Conference of Presidents, Malcolm Hoenlein, how are they supposed to, how did they react when I read the book? I was getting the impression that Peter was basically accusing major American mainstream leaders of either not caring enough about democracy in Israel or that they were just not prioritizing it and instead blindly following Israeli policy.
Well, there's a lot of misstatements there, and that's one of the areas where I think he made some very fundamental misjudgments. Look, of the gentleman he mentioned, I know David Harris, obviously the best. I've worked with him for over 30 years at this point and worked under him for the last 2 decades. He'll be the first to tell you, don't construct Jewish identity and don't construct Jewish peoplehood on the basis of it's hard being a Jew, or the Jews have too many enemies. He knows full well, and he believes full well, that the basis of constructing Jewish peoplehood is upon positive Jewish identification, common Jewish aspirations for a better future, and historical memories of what the Jews have meant as a people. That said, without question, the American Jewish establishment raises some very fundamental political questions, which, again, I don't think Peter probes as carefully as he should. The Conference of Presidents, for example, was set up in 1954. It was set up with the memory that back in the 1930s, you had 50 different Jewish organizations, each coming down to Washington with its own rescue plan. And the end result is that no one got listened to. The whole idea of the Conference of Presidents is whatever our disagreements are, over one or another aspect of Israeli policy, when we go down to Washington, when we're talking to centers of power, our main message is to keep America and Israel as closely aligned as possible. Now, that's a political judgment that Peter disagrees with. But in terms of, it's not so much the content of the disagreement, it's a question of political wisdom, of is there more to be gained by a lobbying effort that tries to keep close special relationship between Washington and Jerusalem as closely aligned as possible, or the kind of cacophony of voices in which everyone's making Shabbat for themselves. One other point in this regard here is that one of the things Jewish organizations should pride themselves, that again Peter does not give enough credit to, is that the special relationship between Washington and Jerusalem is very much of a post-1967 phenomenon. It didn't exist during the Eisenhower years, not even during the Kennedy years. It exists primarily because of the constant vigilance, intense pressure of the American Jewish community that says we want Washington to be behind Israel. That's much different than France or England or other liberal democracies. That's one of our great success stories. Peter doesn't give that enough credit.
Finally, we have to wrap up quickly, but in your op-ed, your infamous op-ed, in response to his book, you state that his idea of boycotting and divestment from the settlements is counterproductive, largely in part because it can't be just limited to that. It will eventually make its way to Israel, thereby demonizing Israel as a whole. Just say a few words about that.
Sure. Look, this whole idea of a partial boycott doesn't play itself out in a vacuum. It plays itself out in the context of a fairly widespread BDS movement, which is not about West Bank settlements or West Bank policies on the West Bank. It's about the legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish state. The kind of targeted partial boycott that he calls for inevitably is going to be translated as part of this delegitimization movement of Israel itself. Also, I'm a little stunned, or surprised anyway, that there's certain myopia here of, let's say this thing went ahead with a partial boycott of the West Bank. Well, aside from the serious economic implications of that for people who are living there in accordance with governmental law, not every West Bank settler is rejecting the authority of the State of Israel. So aside from the serious economic implications of that, what is that going to do in terms of how Israelis will react? It's counterproductive. The West Bank settlers will then say, look what we're up against. Our own people are boycotting us. If you don't think that's going to have a rallying cry that says, essentially, support the settlers. So in that sense, I think he's being quite myopic in his ideas there.
Thank you, Steve. This has been very enlightening. No matter what your beliefs are on Peter Beinart's book, I think we can all agree that it is in the Jewish spirit and in the best interest of Israel that we keep debating and talking and moving forward and making progression. Steve Bayme from the AJC, and thanks for tuning in.